So thank you everyone for joining us either here on Zoom or on YouTube for our discussion with Dr. Lucas Wilson about his book on conversion therapy survivor stories. I do want to begin by acknowledging that I live and work on the traditional territory of the Coquitlam First Nation. My name's Ian Bushfield, and I'm the Executive Director of the BC Humanist Association. Tonight's event is with Dr. Lucas Wilson. Lucas is a SSHRC Postdoctoral Fellow at the University of Toronto Mississauga. He is the editor of Shame, Sex, Attraction, Survivor Stories of Conversion Therapy, as well as several past books on the Holocaust. We were just talking before about how Lucas seems to be attracted to unpleasant topics, but they're important ones, of course. His writing has appeared across a number of outlets, including The Advocate, Queerty, LGBTQ Nation, and Religion Dispatches, both in Canada and the US. He is currently working on a new edited collection about queer experiences at Christian colleges, universities, and seminaries, and we're going to have him back to talk about that when it's published in a year or 18 months. The process is very slow in academia, as we all know. For those who aren't familiar with humanism, it is a worldview that promotes free inquiry, science, and compassion. The BCHA was among those voices who supported the effort to ban conversion therapy in Canada several years ago, which became law 4 years ago today. It didn't take effect until January, but we thought we'd mark the royal assent of that bill with this webinar. And a couple housekeeping notes before we begin. For those on Zoom, I've muted your microphones out of respect for those listening in. I ask you to please keep them muted except for when you're recognized for the questions at the end. You're not visible on Zoom unless you speak, because I have the thing set to focus on whoever's talking. So if you do speak, know that you will be live streamed to the internet. For everyone, please hold your comments to the end. We are live streaming to YouTube, so I'll take questions from the members on the call first before looking to the chat for YouTube comments, but do feel free to put your comments either in YouTube or in Zoom. And finally, we're in our year-end fundraising drive. We've accomplished a lot this year, from declaring BC Municipal Council meetings prayer-free to ending the anti-abortion billboards that blight the drive into Kelowna. You can help power our continued success and make more events like this successful in 2026 at bchumanist.ca/donate. So with that quick introduction, I'll turn it over to our special guest, Lucas. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Ian. Thanks so much for having me. I'm super excited to be here. And I am going to share my screen so I can share a PowerPoint with y'all as we speak, just to guide the conversation. Okie dokie. So like Ian said, my name's Luke, or Lucas Wilson, whichever you prefer. Doesn't matter to me. I am a postdoc at University of Toronto Mississauga, formerly a postdoc at University of Calgary. Most of my research, again, has focused on the Holocaust and/or white Christian nationalism. And so I'm focusing my research on white Christian nationalism, specifically on conversion therapy or conversion practices. And we'll talk more about the vocabulary and the terms today. And let's just jump into it. So whenever I talk about conversion therapy, I always feel like I have to put everything in quotation marks. And I think that goes more broadly for like anything about evangelicals or white Christian fundamentalists or Pentecostals. I feel that, the term conversion therapy is a misnomer, right? There is no conversion involved, no one changes, and there is no therapy involved. And I always say that one should not have to go to therapy after going to quote unquote therapy, even they're the quote unquote. So I'll do my best not to put quotes around everything. It is very tempting to do that just because, again, the nature of the topic. But at a certain point, quotation marks somewhat lose their meaning when you put them around everything. So I digress. So today we're talking about what is, traditionally understood or traditionally referred to as conversion therapy. There are a bunch of names for conversion therapy that folks who practice conversion therapy use, and also terms that researchers and activists and survivors use as well. And so for folks who are practicing conversion therapy, they don't refer to these practices as conversion therapy. It's not really a cute look anymore, right? The PR of the term conversion therapy has lost a lot of credibility for a number of reasons, and we can talk more about that. But they do mask the work that they do using euphemistic language, right? So they refer to it oftentimes as reparative therapy, desistance therapy, reorientation therapy, reintegrative therapy, gender exploration therapy, and the list goes on and on and on. And that's typically what you'll find with more quote unquote sophisticated approaches to the topic, or, masks for the work that they do. But what you find is that in religious settings, and I will say that the vast number of instances of conversion therapy that we know of are happening in religious contexts, particularly in high control Christian contexts. Not to say it doesn't happen elsewhere, in secular contexts, in medical contexts, right? We definitely see conversion practices, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. But the vast, vast, vast majority of conversion practices are happening in religious, specifically Christian contexts. And so in these contexts, they will refer to conversion therapy not as, again, conversion therapy, but instead as pastoral counseling, as biblical counseling, as biblical worldview counseling, or anytime you see, and you'll see this a lot on churches or ministries' websites, when they talk about, holiness and seeking out, wholeness as well as holiness. And if any reference to gender or sexuality in that, listing on their website for what sort of, services they might provide, 9 times out of 10, this is a dog whistle for conversion therapy. And so these are the terms that these folks use. As for researchers or activists or survivors, there are, again, a number of terms that are used. I use a lot of these interchangeably, and feel free to do so yourselves. But, conversion therapy is the term that, is most sort of recognizable by a general population. And so typically it's what I use, especially when I'm, publishing on the topic. But also conversion efforts, SOGIES, which is sexual orientation, gender identity, and expression change efforts, or just change efforts for short. It's quite a mouthful. Or conversion practices, right? And when I think about conversion therapy, I oftentimes think about conversion therapy being sort of programmatic approaches to changing an individual's sexual orientation, gender identity, and/or expression. But conversion practices are a little bit broader, and we're going to talk more about that, and how conversion practices affect not just perhaps we can say that not every queer person has undergone conversion therapy, but every queer person has undergone conversion practices. And we'll talk more about that as we go. So what exactly are we talking about when we're talking about conversion therapy? At its core, these are efforts to change an individual's sexual orientation, gender identity, and/or expression, right? So it's efforts to repair, reduce, or suppress any non-normative expressions or identities as they relate to gender and sexuality. And conversion therapy ultimately is not just, or I should say, the conversion therapy is based on conversion ideology. And conversion ideology really are pejorative or negative beliefs and teachings that frame queerness as pathological, as incomplete, as degenerate, as sinful, as sick, right? So all of these negative sort of understandings of queerness, whether we're talking about gender or sexual queerness, these are framed in such a way that they are bad and they ultimately need to be fixed. And so conversion ideology proposes that there are a number of sources or causes for queerness. Some of these sources include, an overbearing mother or an absentee or emotionally distant father. If we're going to get, sort of pseudo-Freudian on the topic. We also have a number of claims that pornography can cause queerness, that, a predatory member of the opposite sex can cause queerness. So oftentimes they'll say that, child abuse is a cause for queerness. The idea of, negative relationships with the opposite sex, the idea of demonic possession or affliction, right? These are what are oftentimes framed as the causes or the sources for queerness. And conversion ideology is predicated on a binary understanding of gender. And at the core of, these issues of queerness, conversion practitioners will claim that at the core, it's not actually a sexuality issue for anyone who is, a sexual minority, but instead it's a gender issue. So gender figures really prominently in this ideology. And again, it's based on this binary understanding of gender. So very much, men have to act like men, women have to act like women. And they'll say, and I'll use myself as an example, they'll say that, for any young gay boy before puberty, that whatever the source or the cause, might have been, that we have this young queer kid. And really, it started off as gender confusion. So they'll oftentimes say that, for children, they're confused about their gender for whatever reason. But the fact is, according to these folks, that they're confused about their gender. So they will live more comfortably in the quote unquote opposite gender. And so for a young gay boy, if I was, well, I mean, it's true. When I was a kid, I was very much playing with my sister's toys, right? Playing with her doll houses, going into her closet, metaphorically and figuratively, trying on her dresses, this kind of thing, right? And so because of that, I was living more comfortably in the world of femininity. And again, think of the opposite, quote unquote, for young queer girls, that they're living in the opposite world. So they're, tomboys doing, playing sports, playing in sandboxes, whatever. And so for me, when I hit puberty, according to this ideology, I went for what was opposite of me. And so if I'm living comfortably in the world of femininity, what would be considered opposite would have been masculinity. So I became attracted to the opposite sex because I was craving what I lacked, according to this thinking. And then over time, I habituate this, same-sex attraction, and I started acting on it and living into it to such a point that I develop an identity as a queer man. However, what these folks ultimately argue is that there's no such thing as queer people, which is sort of this wild sort of claim. But instead, it's that people are confused about their gender and then therefore confused about their sexuality. And they're all latent or potential heterosexuals just struggling with same-sex attraction. And the way to fix this are conversion practices. So these conversion practices, again, they're not going to name them as conversion practices, but what they do and the efforts that they sort of the efforts that they make are attempts to reorient someone's gender identity, gender expression, and/or sexual orientation. There are numerous conversion practices, right? Typically, what you're going to find is quote unquote talk therapy, right? So the more sort of counseling informed psychological approach to changing an individual's sexual orientation and/or gender expression or identity. There's on top of that, there's aversion therapy. So associating something negative with something that one wants to change. In this context, if it's, one's sexuality, the typical or perhaps most damaging or physically damaging form of aversion therapy is electroshock therapy. But there are a number of other, psychologically and emotionally and, physically, abusive efforts to change people's orientations. These include forced relationships. So pushing someone to marry the opposite sex, quote unquote, thinking about also forced sexual relations, so forced rape. This is not and has not been historically an uncommon practice. And there's also the idea of exorcisms, prayer as forms of as conversion practices. That again, these are different efforts that are used to change an individual, to align them with the heteronormative model, and to ultimately, if possible, change them into heterosexuals. So this is what we're talking about when we're talking about conversion therapy. I alluded a second ago to the different consequences, and the consequences are legion, right? If we're talking about psychological consequences, and the title of my book, of course, points to this, the number one cited consequence for conversion practices is shame. This is according to a recent Canadian study, but there were numerous and are numerous other consequences that fall under the umbrella of psychological or social. We can think of anxiety, we can think of guilt, we can think of lifetime suicidal ideation. We can think of increased dependency on drugs and alcohol. We can think of increased chances of homelessness, or experiencing homelessness, I should say. We can think of isolation, overall poor mental health. And again, the list goes on. There are spiritual consequences. I'm not so much invested in conversations of spirituality at this point. However, for those who are, there is an impact on folks' ability to construct existential meaning, their understandings of the divine or, a higher power, their relationships with their spiritual communities or former spiritual communities, right? Physical, again, aversion therapy and other sort of physical efforts that, again, are all sort of tangled up in the psychological, social, and the spiritual. So these are some of the consequences of conversion practices. And, the research, of course, suggests that it's not just that conversion practices don't work, but they are actively harmful, right? That conversion practices constitute definitional abuse. And so to give a small history or a short history, we have to sort of rewind back to the 1800s. So the mid 1800s, the words heterosexual and homosexual come into the modern lexicon. Up until this point, heterosexuality, homosexual, homosexuality, these were words that did not exist. And then all of a sudden they're introduced, and of course, quickly into, a word being introduced into any lexicon, people start theorizing about these terms, right? And so people started thinking, okay, what does it mean to be homosexual, heterosexual? Where do these things come from? And of course, very quickly, homosexuality is pathologized, or at least seen as negative or bad or death dealing. So people start trying to figure out, okay, how do we solve this problem? How do we fix these folks and get them to where they need to be to make them healthy, productive citizens in society? And so again, a number of theories start to proliferate. We can, of course, if we think, if we fast forward to around the turn of the century, we have Freud, and then we have a bunch of post-Freudian theories of human sexuality. And so all of these theories are working in tandem to the point where people again start actively trying to change people's sexual orientations. And so early instances of these, conversion efforts include forced lobotomies. If we're thinking in the Canadian context, there was forced testicular transplantation, so taking out the testicles of a gay man and then transplanting, testicles that are assumed to be straight. They don't actually know, obviously, but of men who are assumed to be straight, and then putting them into gay men. And then, if we fast forward even further, if we get up to the 1950s, this is when the first DSM is introduced. And when the DSM is introduced, of course, this is a manual that is codifying a lot of the sort of psychological theories in one place. And of course, there's an assumed authority of the DSM, and in part for good reason, but another part, when we're talking about sexuality, not so much. And so this is when the idea of homosexuality is really pathologized in a concrete, tangible way. From there, 50s into the 60s, up into the 70s, a number of other theories start to proliferate, right? This is where the idea of childhood abuse being a cause for queerness sort of is introduced. The idea of the overbearing mother being the cause for young gay boys, that they become overly dependent upon their mother and then therefore don't know how to attach to the masculine, and then as a result are queer. So this is where a lot of these theories come from. So up until this point, all of these theories really were in the secular context, right? Specifically the medical and the psychiatric and the psychological. And then we hit the 70s and Jesus, breaks onto the scene. And so if we're talking about the first ex-gay ministries, these really started actually in Australia in about 1972. And then 1973 in the US. From there, these ministries start to proliferate. They first start in the US, if we're talking in the North American context, in Southern California. And so Love in Action, Exit, these were some of the first, which was the ex-gay interventionist team, I believe. These were some of the beginning, or some of the first ex-gay ministries that started to crop up. Then, again, there were other ministries that were sort of, starting to form around the country. And by 1976, they have the first big conference in the US on the topic. And this is where Exodus is formed. And Exodus became eventually the world's largest ex-gay ministry, eventually became Exodus International. And from there, again, a number of other ministries started to latch onto or learn from, this sort of flagship organization. And throughout the 70s, really, we're talking about efforts to change individuals' sexual orientations largely. And it was done really in a spiritual sense, that they drew upon, their interpretation of scripture that said you could not be queer. And then they asked for, through the transformative power of Jesus, by way of prayer, for folks to change. So it really was a theological and a spiritual, religious effort, or these were efforts to change folks. But then when we get to the 80s, this is where a number of Christian researchers and psychologists, and I use both terms, researchers and psychologists, very loosely. Again, I would do my best not to use quotes around everything. But this is where a number of these folks come in, and they start proposing ideas about how individuals can change their sexualities by way of psychology. And again, it's not the first time that this has happened. This really did happen really in the secular context first. But this is where these Christian practitioners merge and marry the theological with the bunk science, the pseudoscience that supported their ideas. And so what happens is these folks start writing books, they start offering programs, and then these ex-gay ministries catch on and hear about them and say, well, gee whiz, if we, buy their books and if we, use their resources, we can, again, expedite the process of changing individuals, not just through Jesus, but also, again, through a Christian-informed sort of psychological approach. So these two groups, the ex-gay ministries and then these quote unquote scientific or Christian researchers, they joined forces. And of course, for the ex-gay ministries, they're receiving legitimacy or what they perceive to be legitimacy by saying, well, we're following these, Christian psychologists and their teachings. And of course, for the Christian psychologists, what are they getting from this? Money. So they form this symbiotic relationship, right? Where they're buying their tapes, their talks, their books, and they're coming to their conferences, their churches, their ministries, and all of this. And so these two groups start to work together in tandem. And this is from the 80s into the 90s. And this was really the height of the ex-gay movement. And they were working together again, proposing and advertising to not just those within their religious communities, but those without, right? Those beyond their religious community, saying we can change you. If you're looking to change, please, use our services. And of course, in the 80s and into the 90s, we're also thinking about the AIDS crisis, right? That a lot of folks were terrified of what it meant to be gay and the quote unquote gay cancer. And so these were ministries that people outside of, religious communities latched onto because they believed that they could again change and then live a life of, normalcy, quote unquote, and then, not die from this mysterious disease. So all of these things were working in tandem. But around the late 90s and into the 2000s, we see a number of these leaders from these ex-gay ministries start to fall. Right? We can think of John Polk at a gay bar in Washington, D.C., and how he, his credibility was immediately shot the moment he was seen there. We can think of other folks, Mike Johnson, not Mike Johnson, pardon me, that's a different story. But other, conversion therapists and advocates for conversion therapy who were seen and found in, meth-fueled orgies in motels off the sides of highways, right? All of these sorts of moments that really, again, delegitimize the leaders and ultimately the movement. And so a number of these leaders start to, leave, and they, on their way out, say it never worked. And of course, again, this is really bad PR for these organizations. And from, obviously, we're also thinking of, in the 2000s and then, past the aughts, we're thinking about a time when, understanding of gender and sexuality were starting to be, talked about more publicly, that there were changing societal notions around things like gay marriage. Of course, in Canada, 2005 is when gay marriage is legalized. In the US, 2015. And so these sorts of moments are also, again, changing societal perceptions of, queerness. And then eventually in, I believe it was 2013, Exodus International closes its doors again, because it never worked. And Alan Chambers, the president at the time, recognized this, and they had to sort of close up shop. And so all of this was good news, right? That we're seeing sort of, again, the facade, and we're seeing, how ineffective these practices are. Again, there's also increased research on the topic of conversion therapy or gender and sexuality more generally. And all of these things seem to be really good. And they were good, right? However, even with the closing of the world's largest ex-gay ministry and with these other ministries, doesn't mean that these ministries went away. There were, in fact, a number of splinter groups that sort of spun off from Exodus as well as other ministries. And these groups continue to operate until today. The best known and perhaps the most active is the Changed movement out of Redding, California, out of Bethel Ministries, for anyone who knows them. They're a bunch of crackpots, but they are by far the most publicly sort of vocal ex-gay ministry. And what we found with the closing of Exodus and the falls from grace of these different, leaders was that a lot of these organizations stopped advertising to those outside their communities and started going inwards. Again, the change movement being perhaps the best known exception to this. But by and large, most of these ex-gay ministries, most of these conversion practitioners really just started advertising behind closed doors and within their communities. That they weren't telling people what they were doing. Instead, they just started doing it behind closed doors. Again, they were always doing it behind closed doors, but really trying to be secretive about it and actively secretive about it. Of course, in Canada, with the ban from a few years ago, this is, of course, phenomenal at a very sort of preliminary sense, right? It's very much symbolic because up until this point, no one has really challenged this law, which we can talk more about that after. But it really hasn't done anything in the sense that conversion practices we know still happen in Canada. Right? Just because something's illegal doesn't mean that it doesn't happen behind closed doors. And again, there are a number of instances from Alberta to Toronto and beyond where we know that conversion therapy still happens. And again, you can sometimes check on websites and see the euphemistic language they're using. These are dog whistles for those of us who are ear to the ground. We know what they're doing. And then on top of that, there are people who have done undercover investigative sort of explorations of these different ministries and organizations. And so we know that it still happens. It's just something that, again, has really retreated inward, but nonetheless persists. And so if we're talking about conversion practices in North America, if we're talking about Canada specifically, we have limited research on the topic. And right now, what we have is about 4% of sexual minority men. And that, of course, does not include women or gender nonconforming folks. We only know about cis men. And 4% identify as those who have undergone conversion practices. Of course, we have a nationwide ban. We just talked about it. It's a good start, but we need to talk more about this. But really, the 4%, and then in the US, about 7% of all queer communities self-identify as survivors. And I always question these numbers. And again, I think they're a great place to start. I think that we need to be skeptical, though, for a number of reasons. One, a lot of folks don't actually or did not even realize or do not realize that they underwent conversion therapy. For me, I mean, I didn't understand my experience as conversion therapy until afterwards. I thought I was just meeting with the pastor and trying to, live in sexual and, godly wholeness. I thought I was doing, what was expected of me. And I thought, well, this is just what I'm supposed to do because, again, I can't be a Christian and queer at the same time. I realized later that that's definitional conversion therapy, right? The meetings that I had over the span of 4 years, we'll talk about those in a second. But I didn't identify as a conversion therapy survivor until it was explained, sort of spelled out to me. And now it's, again, quite clear. So there are folks who don't even understand themselves as survivors. So I think that's one impediment or sort of obstacle to having accurate numbers. The other, and I think the major hurdle we have to cross is, and I don't know how we would ever address this, is that a lot of folks who are survivors or continue to be subjected to conversion practices are still in religious communities. Right? These are folks who are active in their churches and in their, again, conservative religious contexts, families, whatever. And they don't trust researchers. They don't trust medicine. We can think back to the COVID-19 pandemic. We can think back to, again, how they didn't trust public health. Again, medical professionals, scientists, researchers, etc. So these are folks who are highly skeptical of any sort of, study on the topic. And again, being interviewed for these studies, right? They don't want to participate because they don't trust these institutions. So for them, and again, this is where most of the vast majority of conversion practices occur in these religious communities. For those who are still in these communities, they're not going to participate. So the numbers that we have, again, are a great start, but they don't give us a full picture, and they never really will until these religious communities dissolve. But I don't think that's happening anytime soon. So that's give a little bit of a lay of the land in Canada and also the US, and over over half the states in the US, as well as different municipalities in certain regions within the US have bans. There's of course a Supreme Court case going on right now coming out of the state of Colorado, which is sort of a wild case in the sense that the conversion therapist is arguing that her inability to practice conversion therapy is an infringement upon her free speech, which, US folks always love their rights, right? This idea that free speech is being infringed. Of course, every professional, association from engineers to doctors to, again, therapists have a code of conduct that supersedes their ability to, speak freely while they're on the clock, but is seemingly not something that this conversion therapist understands. So that's the lay of the land in North America. I always want to bring this up and highlight as sort of the climax of my talk whenever I give a talk on conversion therapy, and that is I'm really drawing upon the research of Christine Robinson and Sue Spivey. These two are coming out of the state of Virginia from James Madison University. They both do phenomenal work on conversion therapy. I actually have a book chapter coming out with Christine next year about the homosexuality as addiction narrative, and Jerry Falwell's sort of popularization of that. We can talk more about that later if that's of interest. But these are two sociologists whose work, really informs mine. And they have an article. It's called Genocidal Intentions. And in this article, they talk about how conversion therapy is motivated by genocidal intentions. And I think that, at first blush, some folks might think that this sounds a little histrionic, right? This might sound a little melodramatic. But if we think really quickly and sort of break it down in really simple terms, it can be seen very clearly that, in fact, conversion therapy is motivated by genocidal intentions. And that is to say that if conversion practitioners could have their way, queer people would not exist, right? That these are folks who are dead set on ensuring that there is no such thing as queer expression, that there is no such thing as queer representation, there's no such thing as queer identity, and that there is no such thing as queer vitality. They work actively against and attempt to disenfranchise and ultimately erase queer people for the sole fact that they're queer, right? And this is a well-funded, well-organized global initiative that we see throughout the world, of these folks who are actively trying to change people. Again, we know that it's not going to happen. However, that doesn't mean that their efforts to change people don't have death-dealing and dangerous, and in many cases, disastrous consequences. So even if we know that this can't really happen, and there are some people calling for like the physical or bodily, demise of queer people, and including in North America. These are by and large, in comparison to the populations that we're talking about, fringe. However, what I will say is that not all genocide is physical. Of course, we can think about indigenous genocide against indigenous folks in Canada. We can think of residential schools. We think of the 60 Scoop. We could think of the history there, that it's not always bodily, it's not always physical. And so again, not saying that these folks are out there committing genocide. What I am saying is instead that their efforts to change people are motivated by genocidal intentions. And so I think when we think about it in these terms, we can think about how the dire situation that a lot of folks are finding themselves in, again, specifically in high control religious communities. And so I think that language matters. And so this is what I always want to bring up. Now, for where this all began, who I am, why I even talk about this. I went to Jerry Falwell's university. I went to Liberty University, the largest evangelical university in the world. And it was there that I underwent 4 years of conversion therapy. And eventually, when I left, I went to grad school, and I was doing a lot of work in Holocaust studies. Most of my work really was in the intergenerational transmission of trauma between survivors, their kids, and their grandkids. And I also looked at how Christian theology and the Christian scriptures themselves laid the seedbed for the Holocaust. So looking at before and after, not so much during. And while I was doing this work, I quickly realized that, having any association with Liberty University was not a good look on my CV. It was very much a blemish. And I thought, well, gee whiz, I need to change that. And I need to separate myself from Liberty as much as possible. So I thought, well, let me write about my experience there. And one of the first things I wrote about was about my experience in conversion therapy. And that article led to another article, which led to another article, which led to podcasts and interviews, and sort of just snowballed. And I really thought about it, writing about it in public-facing forums and not really thinking about it, how to approach the topic academically. But I was on a research fellowship in Charleston, South Carolina, and one of my the folks I was interviewing for what was my dissertation, which became my first monograph, he said to me, he's like, Luke, you realize what you're doing, about the children and grandchildren of Holocaust survivors, you do about, folks who went to Christian universities and, colleges. And I was like, well, gosh, maybe I could. And so I decided that I was going to shift my focus. And this was also coming on the heels of being told by one of my dissertation committee members that I needed to shift my focus. No one really cared, in his words, and he was a Jewish committee member. He said, Luke, no one cares about Jews anymore. And I remember thinking, well, that's not true, but okay. it was sort of a signal for me that I needed to again shift my focus. And I thought, well, what do I know best at this point? I understand the white Christian nationalist world quite well. I went to, a flagship university that again fuels this movement. And to give you an idea, for anyone who doesn't know what Liberty University is, count your blessings. For those who do know, they of course know that Liberty University is not just religiously but politically conservative. Trump has received 2 honorary doctorates. Mike Pence has received an honorary doctorate. Mike Johnson has taught there, and I believe still does through their online program. Folks like Candace Owens speaks there regularly. Charlie Kirk had a think tank named after him in part. And eventually it was changed, and he was eventually, though, invited back to campus, but he was shot and killed about a month before he was supposed to return. To give you an idea, again, of what kind of institution this is, it's politically powerful and terrifying, and this is in part what I write about and what I talk about now. So I had a book come out this year. It's 17 stories, including my own, about conversion therapy. I think I sent the discount code if anyone is interested, or you can just email me. And if not, I think I sent it to Ian, but if not, again, maybe that's my oversight. And I can, again, please feel free to email me. I'd be more than happy to send you the discount code. I'm on social media, so please do connect there. But otherwise, it's been an absolute pleasure to talk, and I very much look forward to chatting and answering any questions or engaging in dialogue with you all.
Thanks so much, Luke. That was a fantastic talk and a good overview of a very heavy subject. Um, I'll let people on the chat think about their comments and questions for a second, and they can either put them in the chat or raise their hand on Zoom or in YouTube. My first question to kick it off, though, is maybe you could highlight some of those stories from your book. Like for the book, you went around and found people who'd survived, right? And got what I imagine, like I haven't read it, I'll be honest, but what I imagine are pretty tough stories. Like, what are your takeaways from that, or what like sticks out in your mind?
Mhm. Mhm. So because I started writing about my experience at Liberty, I had a number of folks who were either current students or alumni who reached out and started, saying, "Hey, my experience was similar, et cetera, et cetera." And then I also had a number of people who also survived conversion therapy, specifically folks who were coming from high control Christian contexts. And so at that point, I just started amassing sort of contacts with a number of folks who had similar experiences, following folks on social media, also writing their names down for in the future, if ever, there is sort of a project that I wanted to work on. I'm sort of a pack rat for information, and my computer's just filled with Microsoft Word documents with like lists of stuff. And so eventually I had an editor reach out to me on Twitter, or the artist formerly known as Twitter X. And this editor said, we've been following your work online. Would you be interested in putting a book together? And at first I thought it was like a scam. I was like, there's no way that someone's reaching out to me on Twitter and asking me to put a book together. So I looked them up. Sure enough, they were real. So was the press. And I agreed, and, back and forth, sort of negotiating what we wanted. And what I wanted really was a collection where there was no there was no fictional accounts of conversion therapy. I wanted only survivors' voices. So even in, Garrett Conley, who wrote Boy Erased, he wrote the foreword, and then the 16 other stories in addition to mine, these are all folks who experienced conversion therapy themselves. And so I reached out to my networks on social media, and then again, I keep lists of people on my computer, and just started saying, "Hey, would you be interested?" And some people said yes, some people said no, but I can at least share this with people, on my social media. And so that's how I got the stories. I mean, not all of the stories were included from the folks I reached out, or who reached out to me and submitted, but a good number of them are included in the book. But as for what I learned from putting the collection together, I think, I had a very particular idea of what conversion therapy was. Because really, up until that point, I was writing about my own experience. I wasn't really doing much, research on the topic as much as I probably should have, but I just wasn't, because again, most of my work really was in Holocaust studies. And so, when I started writing the introduction, that's when I began, sort of my foray into research on the topic. And what I found was, first of all, most of the good research is coming out of Australia right now, and the research from there, they've expanded the nomenclature, right? They've expanded the vocabulary. We don't just talk about conversion therapy, we talk about conversion practices. And what again, I alluded to this in the beginning, and that is not every queer person went through conversion therapy, right? So not everyone went, and thank God, right? That not everyone went through a programmatic attempt to change them, for a sustained period of time. However, every single queer person has undergone conversion practices, right? So anyone who has, had a parent or a guardian or a teacher or a cousin or a brother or a sister, whatever, say to them, don't sit like that. You look like a sissy. Hey, don't, dress like that. You look too masculine, whatever it might be. These are efforts to align that person with the heteronormative model and say, hey, you need to get back in your zone, get back in your place, and follow the script that's been given to you. And so over time, queer folks, as any queer person knows, these messages accumulate and they really build up to such an extent that people start questioning, well, should I be who I am? Is it okay to be who I am? These are definitional conversion practices. And I'm never the person who wants everyone to feel, invited or under the, comfortable and say like, oh, everyone, I'm going to open up the definition so wide that everyone feels included. That's not my goal. But what I will say is that conversion practices also affect cis folks, straight cis folks as well, where perhaps their gender expression, maybe a guy's wearing nail polish and he thinks it's cool and that's what he wants to wear, or he's wearing a skirt, that's just what he wants to wear, and he is a straight man. And what we find is that these conversion practices don't just affect queer people. Again, like 99% sure. But there are a number of cis folks who are told you can't dress like that, you can't act like that, you can't whatever like that. And again, these are conversion practices as well. Again, I don't want everyone I don't collapse definitions just so everyone feels or sort of included. But I will say that that was a surprising sort of realization while putting the collection together, that conversion practices, if we think about these more broadly than just conversion therapy, they affect a significant population. And again, more folks than I initially sort of anticipated before doing this work.
Thank you. Not seeing any hands yet. Give it a second. I wrote a bunch of questions down so I can fill the time talking if
Yeah,
everyone else is feeling a
perfect.
bit shy. I wanted to ask on the effectiveness of tackling conversion therapy. Like you highlighted some of the key things that have happened, including the exposure of the hypocrisy did a lot, like they did a lot to themselves, and the fact it just never worked. So
Mhm.
you can't keep doing something that doesn't work forever. Eventually, people start to realize, and that discredits it as well. But in more recent years, we talked about the conversion therapy ban in Canada, but you pointed out no one's been prosecuted under that. Um, it might not actually ever happen. So how do we tackle this? And I have kind of a follow-up around the criminal law as well, but let's start with that.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, and maybe it sounds cliche, and I guess it is cliche, but I will say that offering stories really does help, and this collection, like the numerous other books out there on the topic, in addition to different public-facing articles that you can find from not just queer publications, but mainstream publications as well. Sharing these stories is important. I think research on the topic is super important because, again, I think that what we found with a number of professional organizations and associations that they have denounced conversion practices, which is great. There is no reputable association that's in the medical field or the psychological field, whatever, who hasn't or denounced conversion practices. There's not one. There are organizations out there who do advocate for it, obviously, but these are not, again, legitimate and backed by any sort of rigorous sort of approach to science. And so that's definitely important. I think too, and this is something that for conversion practices that are happening in Canada right now, really we need to train our bylaw officers much better. And part of that is, and where this is coming from, is that I have a friend out of Calgary, Pam Rocker. She's this, sort of badass, sort of nonprofit worker who works at the intersection of faith, religion, and sexuality. Or sorry, faith, sexuality, and gender. And Pam had heard of this person who was invited to come to Canada. He was from the US and he was speaking at this, I don't know if it was a church or if it was a sort of conference, maybe hosted by a church. And he was a conversion practitioner, right? And he was coming to talk about this. And in Canada, that is not allowed. That's against the law, right? And so what she did, she called her bylaw officer and said, "Hey, this is what's happening." The bylaw officer said, "Well, this organization and the guy don't identify what he's talking about as conversion therapy." And she said, of of course they don't identify it as conversion therapy. You realize it's illegal in Canada, correct? And the bylaw officer said, but again, they didn't say it was. And she said, again, I think you're missing the point. Just because someone said, like, do you think that a drug dealer's out there? And for the record, I don't think drugs should be illegal, but do you think a drug dealer out there should be, is out there saying, hey, like, come buy my, like, the Coke that I've got in my pocket? Like, no, like, that's not what happens. And so in the same way, they're not going to announce it or advertise it as conversion therapy. And so again, she had to break it down for this guy, and by the end of the conversation, there was no conversation because again, there was sort of the inability to hear. And so I think to myself that like bylaw officers and also cops in general, and I think a number of professionals in these sort of these areas need to be trained better because again, there's not only like the systemic homophobia and transphobia that defines a number of these institutions and these workplaces, but on top of that, even for those who perhaps are allies, that they don't understand again the sort of the lay of the land as it relates to conversion therapy. So I think there needs to be much better training there. That's perhaps the most practical answer I could give. Again, in addition to the research and the telling of stories and shining a spotlight on these folks. It would be wonderful if there was a way to have, a court case that would, again, shine a light on these organizations and be a warning to others. But like you said, when's this going to happen? And for those of us, again, who are invested in these conversations, we're not all that hopeful that it's going to happen anytime soon.
You actually hit on what I was going to ask about enforcement and reluctance there, right? You mentioned systemic homophobia in these institutions, and we only need to think back to Canada's history of bath raids, right? Where they went after queer communities. We had our own Stonewall and those kind of pieces of history. And that's where I wonder, like, will these institutions actually enforce the law, right? There was a lot of reluctance, I think, even during the COVID lockdowns to give tickets to churches that met in violation of public health orders. BC did some, but there was kind of a lot of standoffs in others. And this is asking them to go farther, right? It's asking them to take a law that is clear, but apply it on things where they don't put it on the tin because, like you say, why would they put their crime on the tin? And they never did for a long time because it was a bad phrase. Um, Still not seeing questions in the chat. Do put your hand up or grab my attention if you want to add anything. My next question was around diversity of who practices it. So we talked a lot about Christian nationalism, right? And Christian evangelicals, but it's not limited to them. What is your kind of view, or what have you seen from other faith traditions, right? Like a lot of particularly Western faiths, Islam, Orthodox Judaism, the conservative ones have similar views on religion and gender. Do you see survivor stories coming out of some of those communities as well? What about secular communities or atheist, who have very narrow views of gender and sexuality?
Yeah, so if we're talking about, again, religious context, to put aside the significant population that the majority population that practices this, we do see, like you said, in Orthodox Orthodox Jewish contexts, sometimes in conservative Jewish contexts, in the sense that we have three different main denominations: we have Reform, Conservative, Orthodox. Sometimes you see it in conservative, but there are a number of more progressive conservative congregations who actively work against conversion therapy or conversion practices. But for, again, largely what you're going to find is Orthodox communities. And, even in the collection, there's a story from Chaim Levin. Chaim was a part of the lawsuit against Jonah v. Ferguson in the US, which was one of the most successful anti-conversion therapy lawsuits that was, again, it was successful. And they pursued this organization, Jonah, which was a Jewish organization that was offering conversion therapy on the basis of consumer fraud, which I think was just like the most genius way to do this. And they were successful. They won. Jonah has closed its doors, but I do believe that some of the leaders have gone elsewhere and opened up shop again under a different name. But again, we do find this again within Orthodox Jewish communities. There's very much a limited and very narrow understanding of what it means to be a man, and part of that understanding of what it means to be a man and or woman, part of that understanding is very much an essentialist view of sexuality that's attached to this essentialist view of gender. So everyone has to be straight. And so we certainly see that in Muslim communities, this absolutely happens, right? Like this is not something that is exclusive to the Christian sort of, West, or the Christian quote unquote West, should I say more accurately. But what the thing is that a lot of the times, again, what you find is that for folks who are in these communities, they're not going to talk about it. And for those who leave these communities, there's sometimes the fear of retaliation. And again, you see this also in Christian communities. You see this also in Jewish communities. But again, we're talking about Muslim communities specifically. There's a sort of a reluctance to speak against these communities. And so when I was putting the collection together, I got no submissions from any folks who were either Muslim or identified formerly as a Muslim, which is, I wish that I did, but these stories are harder to find. And so that's something. In secular context, 100%, we do see this as well. And we're in familial context, for sure, there are people who just, have a certain understanding of gender and sexuality that is, limited, maybe to put it mildly. And as a result, they try to change their children, and conversion practices happen again within familial contexts as well. It's not just something that you send someone off to, go to a camp or go to a counselor or go to whomever. That this happens within, the home as well. But if we're talking about secular context, if we're thinking what's the most prevalent, what is the most prevalent sort of what are the most prevalent practices? We're talking about transphobic healthcare practices, and these are typically going to be happening in rural communities as opposed to urban communities, right? So urban settings, that you'll find that folks, in small town, Saskatchewan or northern Quebec or whatever, they have not as much access to gender affirming care the way that they would have in metropolitan areas like Vancouver or Montreal or Halifax, Toronto, whatever. And so that's certainly something. And I was reading a study, it was from 2001 today, and in that study, it was a Canadian study. They referenced 24 participants in their study who have undergone conversion therapy. 20 were from Christian context, and then 4 had undergone conversion therapy in medical context, to give you an idea of the sort of the ratio, right? And so again, it doesn't happen only in Christian communities, and it happens again, across the world in a multiplicity of contexts and faith traditions and whatnot. But really, what we're talking about is happening, in these high control Christian contexts.
I see a question from Mike and then one in YouTube. So we'll go to Mike first.
Sorry, it took me a minute to figure out how to lower my hand or unmute. Thank you very much for the topic. This is fantastic. I grew up gay. I probably stayed in the closet 5, 6 years past when I was ready, because the threat of conversion therapy was on my radar. Like, it was just something I knew that I didn't want to go through at the age of 16, 17, 18. When I did finally come out, that was immediately the next step was conversion therapy. It was an attempt to do it, and that's why I'd waited. As I was old enough, I was able to sort of push back on that in a meaningful way. Do you account for any of that, of people spending extra time in the closet or things like that in your research? Did that come up?
Yeah, a lot of folks, oftentimes think that, by being a part of a religious community, and this is maybe, again, very autobiographical, that by being a part of a religious community, I cannot be queer, because I'm a Christian, and those two, sort of parts of one's identity are mutually exclusive within the Christian imagination or evangelical imagination. Emphasis, of course, on imagination. You can be a person of faith and queer. Again, not a conversation or something I'm interested in at this point, but I do think that you can. And I think that for a lot of people, they took cover and continue to take cover in religious communities so that in their estimation and in their community's estimation, they can't be queer and, part of that community. But I do think that a lot of people, to your point, Mike, when you were saying that, people or that you stayed in the closet so that you didn't have to go through conversion therapy. I think this happens a lot, right? If you're a part of a family, or a part of a community more generally, if you are to come out, you know that there are consequences, right? That there's potential excommunication, there's potential financial consequences, right? If your parents are going to pay for your university or college and you come out before that, well, there goes, you now have however much you're going to pay for college or university these days, you have that bill to pay. I think there's also, again, sort of the stigma that comes with it. And there's the fear that people are going to be seen in a certain way. I was always terrified that people were going to see me as like sick and degenerate, that I was going to be associated with HIV, AIDS, and all of this kind of stuff, that just by being queer, these were the associations that I had in my sort of memory or my consciousness. That I thought I was fearful of, right? And so I think that a lot of people do stay in the closet so they can avoid these things. And here's the thing. I mean, there's negatives, there's pros and cons for both, right? To be in the closet is very much a suffocating, death-dealing place to occupy. Conversion therapy is also, right? I always just think of conversion therapy really as the concentrated form of homophobia and transphobia, just in a very specific space, and really sort of hammered into over time, however long you're in conversion therapy. But again, the closet's also not a fun space to live in. It's not a healthy place or a productive place to occupy. So I think that both have, again, pros and cons, and it's such a weird thing to say pros and cons for either of them. Well, I guess there's no real pros for conversion therapy, is there? And also the closet. So I guess what I'm saying is they're both cons. Let's take away the pros. Pardon me, I revise as I'm speaking. There are no pros, there are cons. So yeah, and I think that they both have their, again, how we define con in this sense. Again, is it really a pro to? Anyway, you hear what I'm saying. I'll just be quiet. I think you heard what I said. And Mike, did that answer your question?
Yes, that's great.
Great. The question on YouTube, Randolph is asking, when did you realize the university you were in, Liberty, was engaged in active conversion therapy? Was it a moment or a gradual process?
So I went to McMaster for my MA after I graduated from Liberty. I went straight in. And when I was there, it was a weird world that I occupied at Liberty, right? Liberty was very much this bubble where, it made sense what I was doing. I thought it was good and profitable what I was doing. My conversion therapist, who I just called Pastor Dane, his name was Pastor Dane Emmerich. He framed his work as, life-giving and positive, and then ultimately, like, if I just keep trying and trying and trying and trying, very much instilling this like very cruel optimism, but at the time I understood it in very positive terms, that eventually I would find that one woman I'd be attracted to, like that unicorn of a woman, whoever she was. I never found her, but if I just kept searching, I would, and living according to what God had called me to, the way that God called me to live, then I would at least be living in holiness, and then on top of that, I could potentially find, a wife. And I love it within the Christian imagination. It's like, find a wife. It's like any woman will do. Like, it's just very depersonalizing and dehumanizing ultimately. But I left, and I left this like sort of sacred canopy that was Liberty University, right? Like everything had sort of its place, and it was, everything was neat and tidy and ordered, and I had answers to everything. The evangelicals have the answers to everything, of course. And so I left, and I got to McMaster, where all of a sudden I was engaging in conversations that I had never engaged in. I went to public high school, so it wasn't like I didn't have non-Christian friends friends. In fact, of the vast majority of my friends in high school were not Christians. And when I got to McMaster, I was like one of maybe two Christians in my program. And I got there, and all of a sudden things started changing for me. I started to realize that I was not changing my sexuality, that there was no sort of movement in this right direction, quote unquote. And that's how they always phrased it. And I remember one time I was standing over my kitchen sink. I was in a split level apartment, and I was standing over my kitchen sink washing my dishes, just about to go to the pub on campus to have a drink with a friend. And I was praying to God, and I said, God, like, and I think this was the first time I ever swore when I was praying. And I was like, God, what the fuck? Like, I have tried and I have tried and I have tried to, change. I have, prayed. I have fasted up until that point. If you count the number of weeks that I just didn't eat in the name of fasting as a spiritual exercise, it would have been months that I just didn't eat. Obviously not all in a row, but over the 4 years that I was, fasting. I went and met with Pastor Dane. I, have, done all these things in order to remain holy and to change, and nothing has changed. And I was like, God, what the fuck? And that for me was this moment where I realized, okay, I need to figure out this relationship I have between my faith and my sexuality, because again, if I keep going in the direction I'm going, it's not going to end well. And that's really where a lot of the shame really kicked in, because up until that point, I thought, oh, it's just, I messed up here and here, and I prayed for forgiveness and moving on. But then I realized, well, it's not just that I've done something bad, it's that I, according to this theology, am bad, right? That I, as a person, it's not just I've done X, Y, or Z. I actually am, as a person, the bad thing that I keep. Like, the common denominator here is Luke. It's nothing else. And if God is, perfect, and God's the giver of all good gifts, and I'm not changing, well, that means that I'm the problem. When you see yourself as a problem, that's a problem. So I remember I was talking to a friend later on in my office. She was one of my office mates, and we were talking about what I had done at Liberty and what I'd gone through. And I didn't frame it in negative terms, but she just sort of sat there and reflected openly and verbally and said, oh, so you went through conversion therapy. And I, of course, had heard of conversion therapy, but I didn't think of myself as, one who went through it. And I was like, huh, yeah, maybe. And like, just kept thinking about it. And over time, it just sort of, germinated and manifested into, what I eventually realized was that, yeah, I, in fact, went through conversion therapy. I went to Vanderbilt after that. And it was at Vanderbilt that I was in a Master's of Theological Studies program. And that's where I did a lot of sort of thinking and talking about this, and really started to marinate, in this sort of headspace. And then by the time I got into my PhD, by the tail end of it, I started to work a little bit on these topics. And that for me was really how I came to the realization that, in fact, what I went through is like definitional conversion therapy.
Building off that question, I never asked you this in the prep for this, so don't feel like you have to answer that. But did you lose your faith along that way? And was there a point when you stopped believing, if you did, or if you still believe in God?
Yeah.
You don't, and again, you don't have to answer. It's a personal question.
As a former evangelical, we never really had boundaries. So to this day, I'm always like, yeah, I'm fair game to talk about it all. But no, and the personal is very much defines my work. So any question is, again, fair game for for me. But for me, it wasn't even my relationship to my sexuality, as it relates, or the relationship between my faith and my sexuality, that ultimately was the straw that broke the camel's back and what pushed me to give up my faith. Instead, it was my research on the Holocaust. And I remember I was living in Boca Raton, Florida, which, like, oh my God, like a place I never wish to return to. I loved my PhD program. I just didn't love Boca Raton. But anyway, so I was in Boca Raton, and I was sitting on my couch and I was reading, and I was taking a class on Elie Wiesel. Elie Wiesel, Anne Frank is perhaps the best known Holocaust victim. Elie Wiesel is perhaps the best known Holocaust survivor, Nobel Prize, laureate, prolific author. And I was reading his work, and I remember I was sitting there, and there was this like, as I was reading, I was also on Instagram, like, any good student, and I'm scrolling through whatever, and I see this gal's post, and she had posted something about, that she'd gotten a free Starbucks coffee, and God gave it to her. And there was like some hashtag like too blessed to be stressed or something stupid like that. And I remember sitting there, and I sort of broke it down. And this is when my faith completely, it was within the span of like 5 minutes. And to this day, I think I should have thought a lot of these things, like questions of theodicy and evil and reconciling a good God with a, evil world. I should have thought of a lot of these things like much earlier, but apparently it took me until I was 27 to think of this. And so I was sitting there, and I was like, wait a second. This gal's saying that God gave her a free Starbucks coffee. And presumably there was someone outside of this Starbucks asking for, change to buy a Starbucks coffee for him or her or themselves. And I was like, wait a second. So this person thinks that God took time out of God's day to give her a coffee. But again, we think of, and I was reading Vizel, so I'm thinking of the Holocaust. Like this is what my brain was sort of constantly trading in these conversations. I was like, that is so bizarre. That is not just bizarre. That's actually like quite messed up that someone would claim this. And then, again, so for me, it was just like, I thought to myself, okay, so do I think that God actively, acts in the world, that God intervenes into human affairs? Well, no, I don't, because if in fact that's true, there are times where God's actively giving a gift, in this case, a free Starbucks coffee to sister over here, but over here, so and so is not getting anything, and and again, that would be in my mind, or at least within the Christian like the sort of the theological tradition that I found myself in, that would be an active sort of like decision on God's part to not give that person something, because there's the idea that God gives and God takes away. All these sorts of, again, attributing God some sort of agency to what happens in the world. And again, that's a decision on God's part. So I thought, well, then I don't believe that God actually acts. Then do I believe in a good God? And then it just sort of all sort of crumbled in that moment. So for me, it had less to do with my sexuality and much more to do with theodicy. Again, the idea of reconciling a good God with a fallen world or a sinful world. And that's what got me. I mean, my sexuality had laid the groundwork in a lot of ways, sort of to get me there, where when I was at Vandy, I decided that I no longer believed that the Bible was God's word, but instead these were words about God. For those outside of, these religious traditions, that doesn't sound like a big deal, but for those who come from evangelical backgrounds, like that's like a paradigm shift. And so there were these moments that led up to that again, were really by and large a product of me thinking about my relationship to sexuality and faith. But ultimately it was the Holocaust that tipped me over, and I was like, I don't believe any of this. And I was like, I need to get out. And so I did.
All right, I'm conscious of your time and everyone on the call's time because we're filling up the lunch hour, but I see one last question from Alex, so I'll throw it over to him and then we can close out after that.
Sorry, just trying to unmute. Um, uh, so Lewis, I'm not sure if you follow at all the work of All Out in the U.S. and they're focused a lot on some of the global issues with queer rights and everything. And I mean, quite honestly, I find it so depressing because here we're talking about the issues we're facing with conversion therapy in North America, but and then in Africa, like people are being murdered, right, for being queer. Um, and I'm wondering if you have any suggestions on like, I sign the petitions, I give them money, but you feel kind of helpless, right? And it's just I don't know, it's such a negative comment on humanity when you see what's going on in some of these countries. And do you have any suggestions on what people could be doing?
Yeah, I mean, there are a number of organizations that work across borders that I think that you could support those folks. But I feel the same way, right? I get a number of messages on LinkedIn from folks from certain countries saying like, "Hey, can you send me, I don't know, $20 kind of thing?" And you're like, and there's always the question, is this a scam? Like, are they,
Yeah, yeah,
who are they? This kind of stuff, right?
yeah.
And you feel terrible for even questioning or asking, but at the same time, you're like, well, I kind of have to because I'm just otherwise giving money out to, my next door neighbor. He's just, putting up a different profile. And so, so that kind of stuff, I mean, I feel helpless in a lot of ways when it comes to that. I mean, one thing I was thinking about was actually, again, the study I was talking about today, the 2001 study about conversion practices in Canada. And they were talking about the importance no, this was, pardon me, this was a different study. This was a 2025 study. And they were talking about how, for those of us, again, in Canada, where we have this nationwide ban, even though, again, we still have a number of challenges that face us, why should we care about the US, and in this case, the Supreme Court case that's going on right now? Why should we care about other countries, as well? And I think that the answer is because what happens there impacts what happens here in a lot of ways. I mean, Canada and the US sort of like, sibling relationship. But on top of that, uh, folks from Canada can go to the US and receive conversion therapy. And so we need to be fighting for our, our queer siblings in the US, because again, this has impacts for us and potential consequences for, future generations. As for, helping folks who are, in certain places where, again, it's criminalized. I think there's over like 70 places, whether it be countries, regions or whatever, where it's criminal to be queer. That with that, honest to goodness, I don't know if I have the answer other than to support the organizations, and I can give you a list of the folks, Outright International and whatnot, by way of email. But that's the sort of best answer I have. And if anything, I think Rainbow Railroad, I think, is maybe at the top of the list. These are folks who are doing like literally life-saving work, who are bringing people from different places where it's criminalized or illegal, to be queer or to act on, queerness. And I think out of any organization I can think of, they'd be the ones. But again, there are others. But this is the one I think that actually does the most tangible work and is already again vetted. Like they're not going to be just sort of pocketing the money and moving on to their mansion, wherever. But I think that that's probably my answer would be them, and then maybe even partnering with them.
Okay, thanks.
I think that's a pretty good answer. I mean, it's really easy to get discouraged on issues like this when you consider the misery around the world. I think one of the things we've tried to do is find those wins we can do here in Canada that can set an example and hopefully bend the moral arc of the world. I think of how Canada banned blasphemy several years ago. It's not a crime that had been charged for a long time, but it allowed us to talk about it in the news and the importance of freedom of expression in that context. And, banning conversion therapy kind of falls in the same bucket where it's thankfully a fringe practice. It needs to be more fringe in Canada, but we can use those victories to push our government to be better on the world stage and hopefully, as well as doing the very important refugee work you talked about there, Lucas. So with that, I think we have some optimism to end today's session on. I want to thank you once again, Lucas, for reaching out to me and suggesting this. I get pitches for talks every once in a while, and they're always a bit random, and I never know whether to take them or just ignore them. But I'm glad I took yours and that we were able to bring this together. And I hope this starts a longer conversation over, your academic career, and we can come back and have you again.
100%. Thank you so much for having me, and it was a treat to chat with y'all.
We got some positive comments. Bravo for you as well on YouTube. So I'll send an email to everyone who RSVP'd. I'll get that discount code off you, make sure everyone gets it, and I'll make sure that we send a link to this once it's up so that people can review it. So yeah, have a great afternoon, everyone.
Bye, y'all.